Hello, welcome back to Enviroscope. Your host, Ray George, as usual. Today's very special guest, Mr. Steve Hanna, who is the Deputy Commissioner for the West Virginia Department of Agriculture. Steve, first time on Enviroscope, and welcome.
Thank you, Ray.
I got to confess, when I crossed paths recently, both Steve and I were involved in a re-signing of a memorandum that had occurred in the state 6-7 years ago, and it dealt with an agreement involving something like 13 or 14 agencies, maybe 10 at that time, federal and state, looking at watershed cooperative ventures, etc. It was somewhat amusing because I remember Steve very vividly. I'm sure most of you, our viewers, remember Steve as somehow being involved with the Farm Bureau, and all of a sudden here we are with the Department of Agriculture. So I thought to myself, well, no, wait a minute, we really have to have a show and talk about this a little bit. Steve, just briefly, your background. You are a native West Virginian.
Right. Raised on a farm in Harrison County. Bought a farm sometime after college in Lewis County and still live in Lewis County, having an apartment here in Charleston that I don't like to stay in. I like that farm life a lot better. Worked for Farm Bureau for 22, 23 years.
Well, I think that's where let's spend a couple of minutes on the Farm Bureau. If you're not part of the farming community in the state, you know there's such a thing as a Farm Bureau, and you kind of envision what it must be. But I guess the essence, you're representing the farming community.
Right. Farm Bureau is a non-profit organization, voluntary organization that tries to speak on behalf of farmers using the philosophy that farmers have, and they really set the policy, going through quite a policy development process, discussion, education process, and then it was our job as staff to try to carry out those policies that the farmers wanted to have.
Now, I know from my official capacity representing the United States Environmental Protection Agency, I can think back a number of hearings over the years where we would hold a hearing out in the rural area of the state. Oftentimes, the Farm Bureau was a representative. The Farm Bureau would go on the record stating, either approval of or concerns with an upcoming proposal or what have you. That sort of fashions, I think, some of our thoughts. I know that fashioned my thinking, and I always looked at Steve Hanna as this very formidable opponent, or I shouldn't say opponent, but representative of the Farm Bureau's interests, of the farmers' interests. And that did tickle me a little bit, I have to admit, when suddenly you're, and I said this in jest before the show started, that, here we are going from one side of the fence to the other, but in reality, I've never viewed the farming community in West Virginia personally really being at odds with the Department of Agriculture. I mean, you've had a pretty good partnership.
Absolutely. I've always worked closely with the department. Farmers across the state look for Commissioner Douglas for guidance and direction. Don't always agree, but willing to sit down and talk about it. And I guess as I think back at the meetings that you and I have been in over the years, we didn't always agree either.
No.
A lot of times we didn't agree, but I think we had respect for each other. The positions that
Sure.
we took, was in what we thought was the best interest for the people we were working for. So.
Well, and in some cases, of course, we weren't developing the policy necessarily. We were just trying to protect our interests. But in an earlier show, we were discussing with both a representative from DEP and a representative from the Conservation Agency, which I guess is an element of the Department of Agriculture.
Somewhat. There is a conservation board, which the commissioner chairs that board, and the agency works for that board.
Okay.
It's really no direct tie to agriculture per se, but we certainly work very closely with it, and as commissioners say, chairs that board, and good working relationship, good correlation of the activities that's going on between the department and the conservation agency.
One of the things we focused on, Steve, was the idea that the agency in this particular case was, of course, a key component in looking at these watershed issues. And as we were talking about one of the success stories up in the eastern panhandle part of the state, or the eastern portion of the state, there was this commentary that focused on the opposition from the farming community to a lot of things, particularly initially when they're not well understood. And then oftentimes it's really radical, not radical, but very much of an embracing of the idea and even a recognition that not only was I not being thrown lemons, but I actually had a chance to make lemonade out of this, and you know, it really tastes pretty decently. We actually get something out of it because I'm better off because I've now become somewhat educated, and that sort of led to this business of oftentimes the adversarial component, or what appears to be, is really not so much that, but miscommunication.
Yeah, and I think back as we started that whole process, I don't know, 20 years ago, or maybe even longer than that. It was, I think first of all, it helps to understand farmers and where they're come from.
Mm-hmm.
They're a pretty independent bunch of folks, and have been that way for ever since I've known, and I'm sure before that. And it was a lack of understanding, some mistrust by government, mistrust by those people who farmers felt that it was going to tell them what was going to happen on their land. It was an education process for all of us, I think, on both sides of the issue. We had some extreme people who thought that, you know, probably saw 2 or 3 cows on the hillside, that was enough. If you had more than that, that's more than you ought to have. Heavy hand of government telling them what they need to do, and through that education process, and I think probably one of the best things that come out of it is the installation of many of what's we all call best management practices.
We talked about it a little bit, yeah.
Not only
And in fact, those are voluntary.
voluntary,
That's what makes it important.
voluntary, incentive-based best management practice not only help the environment, but in most cases, they either saved that farmer some money or was practices that helped make him some money. So, you know, that was the big hurdle I think we all had to get over over the years, and that didn't happen overnight.
I know one of the things that struck me on there was a comment sort of made off to the side, but I think it was an understatement. As a bureaucrat, and I really hate the bureaucracy, I try not to be a bureaucrat, but I understand the process. It's easy to not understand at times that this particular constituent, theoretically and probably in practice, has a greater respect for the earth than we really give credit for. Because I mean, you know, if I'm the quintessential farmer, I'm totally dependent on the earth.
Absolutely.
And it'd be almost reckless, if not absolutely stupid, for me to you know, not pay attention to what's going on. And yet I'm not so sure, again, from this communication or educational component, that we always make that direct recognition. You know, we make that linkage that one thing is totally dependent on the other, and maybe just because of, you know, I've always done it this way, there isn't a better way to do it. I'm sure before we had contour planting, a whole lot of other techniques to stop, you know, erosion from occurring. I mean, somebody had to go through this process. Somebody had to have the problem. Somebody had to figure out some way to make it, you know, go away or at least mitigate it. And so it's always been a learning process. The aids that we get are sometimes turn out to be our enemies. They're a great asset, but and I'm thinking back of one of the more popular ways of controlling one of the pests and growth on farms, and there was great abuse, evidently, of the use of this stuff. It was getting in the groundwater. It was affecting fish hatcheries, and so, you know, on the one hand, you had a product that served a purpose, but there was a mentality out there that it was clear that, gee, if 1 teaspoon in a gallon works, 5's got to be better, and you know, there's nothing wrong with it fundamentally. We just got to stop using the 5,
Right.
and that's not an easy process.
And that's right. And you talk about using conservation practices and farmers being, you know, aware of that and being environmentalists. I'm not saying this to brag, but here not too long ago, the Natural Resource Conservation District Conservationist in Harrison County was trying to clean out his files, and he found the name there. The last name was Hannah. Farm plan was written 60 years ago, and it was my grandfather. So I mean, and you know, raised on that same farm, I never made the connection that he was using good conservation practices. But you know, that's been going on a long time, and quite honestly, he and my father both kind of had the opinion if a little bit was good, a little more would be better.
Well, I think we all do that.
And that's, an education process again. And I think that blame can go around a lot to chemical companies, feed companies. All of us can share in that blame. And kind of reminds me when we're providing pesticide training and so forth, whether it's for the homeowner or farmer or whatever, read that label. What that label says is what you need to do. And I think in years past we didn't always have that philosophy, and the label wasn't written very well in those.
Well, I don't think we understood consequences for one thing, and I think we just took things for granted. But you have to be in this unique position, having for 22 years or 23 years been on the ground at the grassroots level, working with, the actual farmer themselves, and developing the trust, developing a role for the Farm Bureau to play, developing a strategy for protecting their best interests, et cetera. And again, I don't think there's this great contrast to being on the other side, and I say that guardedly about being on the other side, but there have to be some interesting observations, having spent all those years, as the grassroots activist, so to speak, and now being on the other side where policy maybe is in fact the prime purpose of the business, and developing a strong relationship and the trust of the folks you were representing before. I know we'd be curious in some of your thoughts and observations there. I mean, you clearly look like you're smiling, so it's not been that traumatic.
No, it really hadn't. Although I do remember the first meeting I went to after I started working for the department, and it was a water quality meeting, and I started to say something, and I thought, now wait a minute, Anna, you've changed roles now. You've got to be a little more careful, at least how you make your statement. It hasn't been a major change, and I thank Commissioner Douglas for that. Mainly his philosophy. He is Commissioner of Agriculture, mm-hmm. and has to have the best interest of agriculture as we go through anything, regardless of what it has to do. Department does have regulations that regulate certain activities. His philosophy, which fits right in with mine, and I think one reason why it's been pretty smooth for me is that if there's a problem, a person has a problem, you need to do whatever you can to help them get in compliance if they're in violation of regulation. Go that extra mile to help. But if they just say no, or get out of here, no, we're not going to do it, then that's a little different story. You got to deal with what the law says and what you're supposed to do. But again, I think it comes back to education and people understanding what all is involved. And I've told the commissioner, and I think everybody knows, my heart's still with the farmer, and I'll do whatever I can to help the farmer, but still knowing that there are things that have to be done, and I think getting those people to understand the whole story is important. And I say I'm not going to become a bureaucrat either, but I've been accused here in the last month or so of getting pretty close.
Well, you can be a bureaucrat with a heart there. At least that's what I'm trying. Steve, I got to believe, representing our viewers who are non-farmers, who are not from the rural parts of the state, maybe have some passing knowledge or whatever, but somehow one would have to think when you read, all the time about the decline of the classic family farm, the survival, the ability to survive these days. Today's farmer has to be dramatically different, I would think, from the farmer 30, 40 years ago.
Absolutely. And we are really concerned within the department and in the farming community of availability of food, particularly after September 11th of 2001. There's a very short food supply in this country, in downtown Charleston or downtown Beckley or any city. What would happen if some major catastrophe hit the real farm belt? West Virginia, we understand, is not a big farm state, mm-hmm. but the farming community puts a lot of food on the table for West Virginia folks. What would happen if those farmers, family farms, small family farms weren't there. I think we saw it this past winter in the snowstorm and ice storm. A lot of those folks were out of power for a week or longer. Those farm folks survived pretty well. It was tough, and I think all of us are softer than our parents or grandparents were, but there's something about that farm family that they can survive in tough times. So it's extremely important, I think, to have that family farm still there. Things have changed considerably. The way cattle are marketed changed dramatically in the last 4 or 5 years, 10 years at the most. The way things are produced, really looking at cost of production. One of the main problems is in agriculture is when you need to buy a product, you buy it at retail value. When you sell it, in most cases, you sell it at wholesale, with the exception of those people who have changed and selling more directly to the consumer. So yeah, things have changed, but that family farm is still terribly important, we think.
I was also wanted to kind of emphasize a little bit I would think there'd be, if you look at farmer to farmer, today's farmer, not just because they're living in the 21st century, but there has to be a better awareness, there has to be a better educated, even in the day-to-day farm life activities, but a little bit smarter overall, the challenges that are out there. I mean, every day that we encounter, the things we're suddenly discovering that we've been doing for 30 and 40 and 50 years, and these were aids at one time, sometimes now become threats because we just didn't understand it at the time.
That's right.
That all those kind of make today's farmer basically a lot better adapted, and even when they tend to resist change, maybe resist it for better reasons than just I don't want to change. You know, that old it was always good for granddad and for me. I ain't about to change. Well, I don't know that that's the attitude as much as even challenging. Why or from a more educated perspective.
I was in a meeting last week, and practically all farmers in the audience, and 3 or 4 of them had questions that all of us so-called experts was having a tough time to answer, and they were technical questions that 5 years ago you wouldn't have heard such discussion.
That's kind of what I was leading towards.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's one of the reasons they're surviving today.
Oh, sure. These were successful farmers that were asking the tough questions. Very, very informed of what's going on, and it's kind of like back to Commissioner Douglas again. When you talk to him about an issue or a problem, he doesn't like to hear a lot of nonsense. He wants facts, and that's the way these farmers were the other night. They wasn't there to listen to somebody just, tell them some big story. They wanted to know, is this right or is this right or what is the answer? So, yeah, you're absolutely right. There's much knowledge of the issues.
What about some of these emerging? We all read about, and I recently was in Mingo County and saw a venture where they're doing fish farming, but on a grander scale, and that wasn't a farm operation converted. That happened to be just taking advantage of an old mine and a water source, and a cooperative effort and some customers, and we can develop several million fish a year and then grow them to whatever size, etc. And yet you get the impression, or at least some of us do, that there are the traditional farmers who are out there looking for these kinds of opportunities as well, whereas we never thought in those directions in the past. And again, there are probably climate constraints being here in West Virginia, but for some things maybe it's not that big of a deal. Do you see more of this happening?
In the fish farming per se?
Well, or just those, extensions of other ways to make it, using, to sort of buoy up what you already have.
Yeah, absolutely. Diversity is pretty much the survival of most farmers, as it is in a lot of other business. I'm not sure about the fish farming. We've been involved with that and assisting with the University Extension Service and some fish farms ourselves. But particularly diversity with the types of livestock, poultry that farmers have. But probably more so is looking at how they can better sell those products rather than just taking what someone offers for them. Probably looking at marketing different than they ever have before, but also diversifying some.
Those of us, again, not in the farming business, I came under the impression probably 20 years ago that the big agribusiness side of the world was, essentially almost threatening. It's kind of like Walmart against the little shop owner. And you almost thought this was sort of a hopeless situation. It was just a matter of time before, the big conglomerates would just take over just because of the sheer dimensions. What is really happening? Or aside from, the other problems of being a small farmer, are they kind of holding their own these days? Are we fairly stable for where we're at, or is it still declining badly, or is it still threatened, or what's happening there?
It varies from the type of farming that people are involved in. There's a so-called 80-20 rule. 80% of the farmers produce 20% of the products, the food and fiber. 20% of those farmers produce 80% of it. But I think in West Virginia, we've seen specialization and as well as being diversified. And it goes with the season. There's peaks and valleys in prices. Weather certainly plays a role in it. Of course, poultry is the number one agriculture product in the state, and those folks have really specialized.
And that wasn't the case 20, 30 years ago.
Oh, absolutely not.
There's a point to be made that there is a place for West Virginia to participate. And would you call that agribusiness in the classic sense? Is this the individuals as much as it is the larger corporations?
Those large corporations would not exist if it wasn't for those individual farmers producing those birds and taking care of them on a daily basis.
But they do it on sort of a cooperative basis, right? Like they contract with these people individually.
They contract with the
so it's an extension of the.
Yeah, it is.
But the investments are made individually.
Those farmers pay for those poultry houses that are $225,000, so they've got big investment there.
Okay.
The cattle industry is the number 2 agriculture commodity in the state. Same way.
Is that beef or dairy?
Beef. Again, have peaks and valleys, as do the poultry. The price varies of how much those farmers get from the poultry they produce. Beef the same way. Dairy is really struggling in West Virginia as well as a lot of other states. Highly intensive capital. Milk prices have been very low. They'll shoot up for 6 or 8 months and then drop again. They're all up and down, all agriculture businesses. But it seems like those that go the extra mile to do a better job are the ones that are surviving.
On the agricultural side, as far as crop growing, is that a major component in the state?
Not as much as it used to be.
We're doing the farmers markets kind of thing as opposed to...
Really promoting that as far as produce to farmers markets, and I think you'll see more of that. And I think especially after the terrorism threat and so forth, you'll see more locally grown produce sold at local farmers markets. We've been promoting that, and last year, very successful. There's a senior markets program where seniors are given coupons to buy locally grown produce, and that program will be available again this year. I see that coming, but again, it takes some specialization to raise those crops that are healthy. And farmers used to have the tendency to keep the best and kind of sell
the rest
trash they had left over, but that's certainly not the case now. They're really gearing towards high quality production.
What's the impact of the agricultural business in the state? It's got to be fairly significant, right?
Yeah, it's a $500 million industry, 400 and some million, almost $500 million. I think the difference is in agriculture, that dollar turns over probably more than other industries. Estimated that it'll turn over 5 to 6 times. that money
Because of
that
the
money
nature of the
spent
business.
is in spent in the state.
It'd be one big hole in our state economy, would it not?
Yeah, and I guess none of us have really done a good enough job of getting people to understand that. As you know,
Well, I think it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. I mean, if you don't live in that area, you don't drive around, you don't even think about it. I
and,
mean,
and I think the other thing, as long as people's got plenty of food, there's no
that's it. I mean,
big issue.
We walk into a supermarket or a corner store if there's any few that are left and buy whatever you want, and
Right.
and we
Yeah.
don't think about it. But
And
Steve, in
we're-
a couple of minutes we have left, I obviously the environment's been my lifetime career, and I say this not from intimate knowledge, but from just pieces here and there. But I tend to believe, if I had to make a judgment, that understanding the environment and appreciation of the environment has been, at the very least, one of the strong suits in the farming community. I mean, it's almost like, if I don't understand that I need good water, I need good conditions to grow, I need pollution-free as much as possible, I need good stewardship because, I'm totally dependent on the land. Who else do you preach to? And if these aren't the fundamental disciples, I don't know who else is. Is that an error, or is that a fair assumption?
No, I think the farmers understand that and have for years. And I think we still need to continue the education process.
I mean, this business is telling them you can't put your cattle out in the middle of the stream, that it's better practice to, keep them out of the, I'm sure that was, well, we always did it that way, but after you think about it and realize that you're probably better off if you don't, because if the guy buzzed me doing it, then, we all stop doing it, we're better off. Is that?
But you have to understand that cattle have to have water, so you've got to be able
You
to
gotta
provide
provide
an alternate source of water. And the education process, if I may, just this week, there was the University Extension Service, the Natural Resource Conservation Service provided an educational program, and the vocational education people had a training session and a contest on grassland farming and for youth, and it's amazing of how the kids understand this issue, probably better than us
Well, that's
old
the
codgers
educational
do.
component.
Right.
I think we learned that in recycling. We learned that in not throwing trash out the back door in this
Right,
state.
yeah.
Steve, we're just about out of time. I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. I don't think we can underscore the educational element too much. I remember the dilemma the state road had a few years ago. Those old one-holer people with stuff in their garbage down. Like, how do you stop this? Well, you start with their children, and
Right.
it has worked. And again, thank you for coming on the show today. We look forward to having you back in the future. And it's been fun kind of seeing the transition of Steve Hanna, Farm Bureau, to the Department of Agriculture.
Almost a bureaucrat, not quite.
Almost. Well, don't ever become quite one. Your host, Ray George. We look forward to seeing you next week and we are helping to keep you informed on the Library Television Network. I want to thank you for watching Enviroscope, and again, we look forward to seeing you next week. Hello, welcome back to Enviroscope. Your host, Ray George, as usual. Please join me in welcoming today's special guest, Mr. Bill Brannon, who is the Acting Director, Water and Waste Management Division, West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection.
Right.
Carolyn Hefner, and Carolyn, you're probably going to be recognized by your viewers as the host of Conservation in the Mountain State.
Yes, sir.
And I think officially, though, you're the Assistant Division Director, Water Resources Section, Conservation Agency.
That's correct.
That's a group I want to take just a couple minutes to talk about a little bit. I know your viewers are familiar with the Conservation Agency, and I've got to confess that I'm not so sure that the viewers who watch Enviroscope are as much plugged in, but I hope they are. I hope they're watching both of us when we're on at our appropriate times. But Conservation Agency, for my own edification, for our viewers, now it's essentially a state agency.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We fall under the Department of Agriculture. Commissioner Douglas sits as the chairman of the board of the state committee. And then we support the 14 conservation districts in the state.
Kind of activities you're normally involved in?
We're involved in a lot of activities. Of course, the watershed dams. We have partnered in many of them with NRCS and putting them in places. We have 167 of them in the state of West Virginia, and we're just now doing a new one in Hardy County. We do partnering components with the Department of Environmental Protection under 319 programs. We've done a lot of those
319
initiatives.
addresses a non-point sources
Non-point
bill.
source program, yes.
Yes,
Okay,
sir.
that's the runoffs that we've talked about a lot of times for our viewers.
Yes. We've partnered with people like Trial Unlimited, Canaan Valley Institute, Department of Natural Resources, Division of Forestry, Department of Agriculture. I mean, almost Corps of Engineers. If you come up with many of the federal and state people, we have partnered with those. And in individual areas, as it relates to that district, you know, that we might bring on a county or city government.
There's kind of a theme here, though, and correct me if I'm wrong, we're principally looking at watersheds and watershed interests.
Yes, we deal a lot in the watershed initiatives.
That's kind of a segue, I think, into why we're here today. Our
Yes.
viewers may be wondering, what's the connection between the Conservation Agency, and even though you had mentioned that there's some partnering that goes on, all of us have participated recently in a re-signing of a memorandum, and I think I'd like to talk about that a little bit so our viewers understand the recommitment that has just occurred and what the focus is, and maybe if we have some time, and I'm sure we will, to get into a success story or two, or certainly works in progress. The memorandum bill was something orchestrated by Secretary Timmermeyer and brought together something like 14 or 15 different agencies.
14 agencies at this recent re-signing, but it has been in place for the past 7 or 8 years. So we signed the first resolution of mutual intent in 1997, and at that point there were 10 agencies, state and federal, who committed to working together, to sharing their resources, to addressing environmental problems on a watershed basis. Many of us have responsibilities in our various agencies to address environmental issues. Our agency specifically deals with water. So the intent was to work together to use available water quality information to establish priority watersheds across the state, to identify what those contributors to those water quality problems were, identify agencies which had authorities or responsibilities for those various activities, and then bring those agencies together to devote their resources, either technical or financial, to establishing projects to deal with problems, to remediate the problems, so to speak.
Carolyn, I think one of the things that strikes me, I mean, I work for EPA, of course, Bill works for the Department of Environmental Protection, we're pretty much parallel, and we're heavily on the regulatory side, but and as a sidebar, but I think a strong commitment nonetheless. We're interested always in trying to get into these areas where you're not necessarily running around with a club, you're trying to bring cooperative efforts together. Your group, on the other hand, is much closer. In fact, you are, in essence, the grassroots element here.
Oh, yes. You know, because you have district supervisors from each one of the counties represented on these boards, and those are the grassroots people. And, you know, through their meetings and so forth, you know, they're around the community, they know what the issues are, and it's a lot better to do things on a voluntary method instead of a regulatory, because when you have those taking part voluntarily, it seems like, you know, there's initiative there to want to get it done, and sort of a goal-oriented type of thing that, hey, in success stories, you know, and they like that. And so we've been very fortunate to be able to have that opportunity.
And that's kind of, I mean, your day-to-day mission regardless, right? I mean, you're out there working at the grassroots level that's why CA exists and why you funded it. So in many respects, the idea of being a participant, if not actually a bedrock element in this whole memorandum, puts you in the forefront. Part of the reason why we're having you here today, so we can kind of explore where we go with this. From our viewers' perspective, you know, this whole concept of watershed is still relatively new. I can remember 10 years ago you mentioned watershed, and it was sort of like this esoteric, wonderful, idyllic, gee, that'd be nice. Yet I think it has now come to where it's proven itself time after time, even in hardcore areas. And I think probably the best examples we have in the state, areas that have historically been heavily abandoned mine drainage impacted. All of us understand that we're talking huge public liabilities. There's not always going to be the kind of money to go out and clean up an entire area. It's just almost physically impossible. There was a time, and I've been in this business for 30-some years, we would throw our hands up and say, that's an impossible situation, let's move on with those things where, of course, we can always regulate, we can always enforce. That's a little different. There came the time, though, when we had to kind of take a hard look back again. What have we done or not done? Somebody planted that seed that, you can go back in, and if you're real careful, and we get everybody to cooperate, we get everybody to agree that we can take baby steps, and those baby steps can become kind of significant little steps, we can actually make an improvement in some segment and actually turn that area around. And maybe that then becomes the incentive to look harder at these other areas rather than just shrug our shoulders and say, well, there's no magic pot of money, we can't do anything about it. That has been, I think, in truth, the real success story and the real impetus behind why we do watershed and why watershed is growing as a philosophy, I think, in virtually everything we do. We've been at this, you mentioned 6-7 years, Bill, that the original memorandum came out. There were probably a couple areas that were targeted at that time. Is there an area in particular we can talk about a little bit today as an example?
But as part of that process, in 1998, as part of the President's Clean Water Action Initiative, one of our tasks in the framework was to identify a watershed or two in the state where we could devote a significant amount of new federal money. The 319 money she mentioned earlier is non-point source program money. States get an appropriation every year to devote to actually putting projects in the ground. We used the framework to identify one watershed in the Eastern Panhandle in particular where we saw a great opportunity to partner with some of our framework partners, specifically the NRCS and the Conservation Agency. I think Division of Forestry was involved as well, and maybe Department of Interior's Fish and Wildlife Service was part of a project as well. Anyway, we worked through these agencies to identify what the problems were, and specifically in that watershed, bacteria was a problem from primarily agricultural land use. In fact, it was one of the streams in the state that was identified as water of special concern on our list of impaired waters, our 303D list. That's another story.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, being on that list requires the state to initiate the development of what's called the total maximum daily load, where you identify all the contributors to a problem and then establish plans to reduce the impacts to that water quality issue. So,
and that has real importance because I think our viewers understand for 30 years we've operated under an NPDES program, which is a permit for the end of the pipe.
right.
And you have some of those folks involved in this process. And then you have this challenge of the non-point sources coming in, which is, I mean, it's not really coming out of a pipe. It's coming somewhat uncontrolled, and some of it's natural, some of it is man-induced, and how do we best handle this? So it is particularly important.
Right. So the stimulus of the framework and some activities that were already underway in the Eastern Panhandle in that part of the state, I think a water quality incentive project had been initiated in the early 90s. There was a significant amount of resource, both technical and financial, there that could be devoted to addressing the water quality issues, specifically bacteria in the North Fork of the South Branch. It was on the TMDL list. That was a federal state requirement that a load allocation be developed. And over the course of the last 5 plus years, we have made significant progress in that watershed. So much so that we're finding very few bacteria violations in that watershed. Our most recent 303D list has created a new category for that stream. It's basically a success story all the way around for all the partners in the framework and all the agency partners that we work with.
Was this primarily addressing the non-point sources themselves?
primarily the non-point source problems that existed over there.
And these were practices that were happening that could obviously be changed.
Right.
Mhm.
I think the majority of the
Education.
funding went to installation of best management practices to reduce the impact from agricultural land
Now, we
uses.
use that term, and for our viewers' sake, that's a voluntary approach.
Right.
It's not regulated, but it means what it says. There are a series of guidelines depending on the kinds of things that you're doing. Probably one that most of us could identify with if we're going along a highway construction project. And you'll sometimes see those look like crude barriers with the black plastic and the stakes in the ground, and some of that's designed simply to
Right.
stop mud runoff from just going every which way. I mean, that's a very simple form, but that kind of thing we call
Right.
BMPs. Gets a little bit more
Yeah.
involved, obviously, we get
in
into
the
some other areas.
agricultural arena, what do you have? Litter
Well,
sheds?
we had litter sheds, composters, fencing to keep livestock from entering the stream, riparian areas where, where they
And if
put
you don't live in a rural
vegetation.
area, you don't really appreciate what some of these impacts are.
No, you don't.
I mean,
You
just
really
a
don't.
simple statement. I remember the first time I read about that we got to keep the cattle out of the stream, and again, unless you grow up in an area like that, you're in an urban setting, you never think about that, and what a simple, relatively simple measure that is.
Yes, it is. And when you fence them out, you've got to have a source of water for those cattle. So watering systems were put in place. Different things like that to help out the agriculture producer. In that we worked with the poultry industry, with the integrators in trying to develop some of these things, because these people are, they're agriculture producers, and hey, they've taken care of the land for all these years, and they don't want to see it destroyed. So that's what their livelihoods are. So
And a lot of this was driven by success in itself. I mean, the
Right,
industry
it
became
was.
explosive, I think, on the poultry side.
It was. And NRCS, USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, when they came on board with this, with the PL 534, with the Potomac Headwaters Land Treatment Program, this allowed cooperators to come in and sign up. And of course, that was a sign up, voluntary. You walk in, sign the paper, but when they signed up for that, it's a long-term contract. Whereby that they implement all the needs related to nutrient management on their farms. And this was a very, very effective way of doing that.
I'm sure there had to be some angst in the initial days, though. I mean, some suspicion, I've never really gotten myself involved in this before. What am I bringing on myself? I mean, there had to be a lot of those kinds of questions, but they've now been put to rest.
Oh yeah, when Farmer A was watching Farmer B putting in, a new litter shed or a composter, putting in a watering system, it was the up and coming thing. So it says, well, how did you do that? Well, I was able to do it through Natural Resource Conservation Service and use loan dollars that was made available through the Department of Environmental Protection. So they could link all these things together and be able to really add to the value of their real estate. So these people were seeing it happening, they were seeing it working, and not only that, but they knew they were going to have to do it. So it's better to go in voluntarily than somebody come back at you many years later and say, you've got to do this, and they don't have the means to do it. So you're out of business. So they saw, many issues being able to be answered at that point.
I'm trying to think back when Commissioner Douglas was a guest on Enviroscope not that long ago. I'm thinking maybe I'm stretching too far here, but I thought he had made a comment that one of the really success stories was whereas the manure element was a liability, it now became something of an asset because you actually export it out and sell it, and
yeah.
it's just a matter of how you handle it, right? One person's waste becomes another person's product to sell, I guess, if it's handled properly, that there had been a real shift.
Oh yes, now, and we've had transport programs set up to whereby we get some of the litter transported out of that area. And of course, the Department of Highways used it as a nutrient in the median strips, for growing the wildflowers and so forth. So yeah, everybody gets a little buy-in on that. So it was a success story, yes.
It's kind of amusing to think of it that way, but out of what some folks look like as an adverse situation, you really come up with some neat ideas, and all of a sudden, lots of folks benefit because of it's like the need is the mother of invention. when we're pushed hard enough sometimes, when we pleasantly surprise ourselves. Um, One of the things, we're talking about that area, and it kind of comes to mind. We're really sort of talking about that northeastern part of the state, and it's blessed on the one hand with a lot of good natural waters, and yet it also has this something of a curse in a way with the karst topography and the fragile nature, I guess is a good way to phrase it. We argue on the one hand that some of the best bottled water potential is there, some of the best aquifers, and not that far away from the city. Yet we've got this tremendous growth spilling over from the D.C. Baltimore metropolitan area. We read about it sometimes in different ways, where there's need for another highway, and the opposition that occurs there because those who've always lived there don't necessarily want to see a 4-lane highway, and those that want to build 4,000 home tracks say we need this because you got to move people in and out, and we sometimes forget about the impact on the infrastructure. Well, it's not even infrastructure, but the ability to sustain all that kind of growth, and it does come back fundamentally to water in this case. And there are those who've been on this show in years gone by who have focused strictly on the value of the aquifers and the ability to be able to exploit in the right way. Sort of the new replacement for coal in some respects, where this could be the greatest future natural resource, this high quality water. Yet in some respects, if we're not real careful, I think there's a legitimate argument that we could harm that very gift, if you would. And we've got this delicate balance between explosive growth that wants to occur every day, and then we throw in the growth in other areas that tends to challenge. We've found some relief. We've found some answers. I think certainly in the CAFO or the poultry area. We had talked a few minutes before the show about some of our own. I mean, you can't have gone into that area of the state, particularly the Panhandle, and not seen the huge growth and the potential. And I have to believe that's maybe our greatest challenge here for the near term and in the near future, from all this perspective.
Certainly the development presents us with water quality issues, but also water quantity issues.
Well, that's what I really wanted to kind of
focus on. Part of the state has experienced in the last few years a severe drought. There were water rationing requirements put in place in Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, even as late as last year.
I think Pennsylvania
as well.
Pennsylvania been in a drought.
I don't know that there were any restrictions put in place in West Virginia, but there were some warnings issued. I think the agriculture community had some water issues. The communities, not so much, but it's only a matter of time before that becomes a real issue for West Virginia interests. And I think during this past session of the legislature, a legislative study was commissioned over the course of the next year to look into water issues in the state of West Virginia, water supply issues. Who owns the water, who should control the water, those kind of issues. And I think it's most severely felt, or will be most severely felt soonest in the eastern panhandle along the Potomac drainage.
I know one of the odd things that came up about 10 years ago, and I'm trying to put a date on it, but it was around 10 years ago. There was a fairly active group here in the state called the West Virginia Environmental Institute. And we'd sort of formed ourselves as a self-styled think tank. Don't ask, but I mean, it had noble intent. And we were approached one time as a group about this issue, and a good pitch was made about why we ought to look at it. And I remember we wound up sponsoring a workshop, a full day in Morgantown, had a lot of cooperation, had good notice to the folks that we thought would be the vested interest. In this case, I think the targets were the municipalities, the county commissioners, a few of the industry reps, folks who use water every day, were in a position to have some role with water use. Maybe never gave it any thought other than the fact it's always there. I mean, it just wasn't an issue in their mind. We even had one of the nation's experts, I guess, in water quality, the idea of water use and who owns it and the riparian laws and the whole bit. Donated his time, flew his private jet into Morgantown, very impressed, believed in the subject enough that he just felt, he had to be heard, and he gave us a couple hours of his time, and he was sort of the highlight of the session. It was driven by a local attorney who had worn a lot of environmental hats in this area, who brought the issue up initially and has since written a legal work that's been accepted by the courts as maybe the basis for who owns West Virginia's waters at this point. And he makes quite an argument about the way the state grew in two different eras and the way the waters were handed out. Some folks actually own out to the middle of the Ohio River and don't understand that. If you own the bank, you actually own out. It's not the state, but you have private rights there. And that really kind of becomes interesting when you start talking about dredging issues and things of that ilk. But it was an enlightening day, and it was a full day of discussion and panels. I'm not so sure at the end of that period, the end of that day, that many of us walked away with a great sense that we certainly had opened the door. We certainly maybe approached that proverbial can of worms. Our intent certainly was to sensitize folks that at the very least, I mean, some folks came in the room, I think that day, thinking somebody here is trying to go to a legislative mode and somehow or other regulate the way we use water. And that was not the intent whatsoever. The intent simply was a response to a belief that we had not, as a state, protected ourselves in any way, shape, or form in terms of dependency on the water. At that time, 10 years ago, there were drought conditions in the D.C. area that were pretty significant. And COG, the Council of Governments, which is the sort of the overriding regional government form in the D.C. area, actually has legal codicils that say, look, when it gets down to a certain flow in the Potomac, everybody that's part of our membership is guaranteed a certain amount of water. I mean, that's by law. You're gonna be dependent on this, and we're gonna ensure you get that. Some of that was driven by waters coming out of West Virginia that, in effect, their attitude was, hey, the spigot's up there, the spigot can't be touched. That flow better continue through here, and if somebody interferes with it in between, woe betide. It was an interesting dilemma. It was an interesting situation. And we felt, at the very least, all we really wanted to do by virtue of that workshop was to instill the idea that we needed to at least record the water we use and make some historical statement that we've been dependent on it, because quite frankly, if it was push and shove at that time, lots of folks could never have stood there and said, hey, we really do use it. We really have depended on it. They really couldn't prove it. Again, we walked out of that 10 years ago, and some of us sort of felt like, well, maybe the message got across, I'm not so sure. In between came the explosive growth in the poultry industry and then some of the other challenges, and of course now the sprawl issue itself, and I'm not so sure that had become very exacerbated over what it was. So it's kind of good to hear, Bill, that there is some initiative in the legislature, and the full intent of this commission is to look at the bigger picture or just the water usage.
Well, I think it's to do what you said the follow-up to that meeting 10 years ago was supposed to do, is to raise the awareness, to begin to look at who's using it, to register that use so that we'll know what the need is, and if control is necessary, then we need to do something to control it, because it's a resource for us similar to coal and oil and gas and timber that could potentially be something that we in the future provide downstream users with in Washington and other states.
Maybe make some money from it.
It's possible that we could someday.
Of course, it sort of brings us full circle again. And with the few minutes we have left, I kind of want to wrap up with, clearly all of this is very consistent with the watershed approach.
Yes,
I mean,
indeed.
no matter how we approach that issue, all the elements are there. I mean, particularly with, you don't have a situation in that part of the state, which is probably the most threatened, with tremendous infrastructure. You don't have existing giant treatment plants and pipes running out serving everybody. So, well, the antithesis would be right here in the Kanawha Valley, where you essentially have a major water supplier. And I remember the time when we had lots of independent water suppliers, and water quality was all over the map. And I think we'd all agree that was a tremendous improvement to have a single, facility basically in a good location with a good water source. I mean, it was a tremendous improvement over just the past 20 or 30 years. We don't have that kind of situation in the Eastern Panhandle, and so it's always going to be fragile, and that whole part of the state is going to be somewhat subject to careful usage and careful control. It's hard to argue against the whole idea of the watershed approach.
And that's right, because everyone lives in a watershed. If
And
they can't
everybody
see the
lives
stream-
downstream too.
That's right.
And I guess maybe there's an extension to this, that even though, we're not necessarily just trying to solve a problem of correcting the sins of the past, we also have the opportunity, by being smart, by being cooperative, of looking towards the future.
Right.
I mean, this is a little different. This, instead of the traditional mine drainage area where, it's hopeless and you hope to get little success stories and you pull together all your resources. Here we have we can plan ahead. We can kind of look at whose interests are going to be necessary, who has to be served. Is it the developers? Is it the road folks? Is it the ag community? Is it growth in municipalities? Is it growth in suburban housing? And how do we best serve all of that? And how do we do it on a watershed basis? There's probably a term for this. We seem like we've always emphasized watershed and the difficulty of the sins of the past or the problems of the past. But I think we even have a greater challenge now of being creative and using the strictly cooperative mode to make sure we don't do those things. We do them the best way we can to serve everybody.
That's right.
And even though the framework is geared toward bringing the agency folks together to talk about the resources that they can make available, the real importance to the whole effort is to bring the stakeholders, the watershed people, the people who live there, who have the ability to decide for themselves what their issues are, what they're willing to accept, what they're willing to do to protect the resource that serves them. So that is a very integral part of this whole process, is the watershed stakeholders, the citizens, the associations, the business owners. Everyone who lives in the watershed needs to be a part of this process.
Well, I think it's pretty ideal, obviously, if you can develop your priorities up front rather than attack, from a priority perspective, problems from the past. What you're really doing is
Right.
being preemptive.
Being proactive, yes.
And maximizing all of our resources. I mean, the good news is it's growth that's causing that to happen over there. On the other hand, though, for the first time, we can be smart about it and not be in a crisis mode. I want to thank both of you for taking times out of your busy schedule. I know, the Conservation Agency, I understand a lot better now, so I thank you for being a guest.
Well, you're welcome.
And Bill, I know, from the regulatory side, we've worked together for years, and I know,
Yes.
The struggle we constantly go through, but it's kind of fun to have a show like this where you really talk about something that's not regulatory. We can work grassroots, and we actually have some success stories occurring. For Enviroscope, I want to thank you for being with us. I look forward to seeing you next week. Today's guest, Carolyn Hefner from the Conservation Agency, Bill Brandon from the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection. We'll see you next week.